The sky over France was clear on the morning of June 26, 1943. 48 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group climbed into formation over their base at Horsham Street. Faith, their Pratt and Whitney radial engines making a sound like rolling thunder across the English countryside. They were headed south to escort B-17 bombers returning from occupied France, a routine milk run that should have been unremarkable in the ledger of war. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson settled into his seat aboard P-47C All Hell, checking his instruments with the methodical precision that training had drilled into him. At 23 years old, he was still green, a novice pilot with a troubling tendency to break formation, a man his commanders quietly believed would not survive long in the lethal skies over Europe. Johnson had never officially qualified as a fighter pilot. Weather had prevented him from completing his gunnery training in Wales. He had fired his guns for the first time in combat. Yet here he was, flying into hostile airspace in an aircraft many veterans dismissed as too heavy, too clumsy to survive against Germany's nimble Fokker-Wulf Fu 190 fighters. The irony would become clear soon enough. Johnson's survival that day would depend entirely on the very qualities his critics saw as weaknesses in his aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug for its rotund, jug-like profile, was indeed massive. At 10,000 pounds empty, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter flying for any nation. Fully loaded with pilot, fuel, and ammunition, it topped 17,000 pounds. To pilots accustomed to the sleek lines of Spitfires or the graceful forms of Messerschmitts, the Thunderbolt looked less like a fighter and more like a flying tractor. German pilots who first encountered it over Europe laughed at its ungainly appearance. That laughter would not last. Before the formation reached the rendezvous point with the bombers, German radar had tracked their approach. 16 Photio 190 seconds from Jagdgeschwader, two elite fighters of the Luftwaffe, positioned themselves above the American formation. They struck from altitude with cannon and machine gun fire, their attack coordinated with brutal efficiency. The American formation scattered. Thunderbolts peeled away in every direction, their radio discipline dissolving into chaos. Young pilots shouted warnings, engines screamed, tracers streaked across the blue. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Johnson saw the attackers too late. Before he could react, 20mm cannon shells began ripping through his aircraft. The first impacts tore holes in his wings. Then the shells found the fuselage. The cockpit exploded around him in a cascade of metal fragments and shattered glass. The canopy above his head dissolved into a spiderweb of cracks and gaping wounds. Hot oil from the engine sprayed backward, coating the windscreen in thick black fluid. Hydraulic lines severed, sending pressurized red liquid spraying into the cockpit, dousing Johnson's face and burning his eyes. The instrument panel disintegrated under cannon fire. Dials and gauges shattered. A shell detonated behind his headrest close enough that the explosion peppered his hands with shrapnel and sent a bullet fragment slicing across the bridge of his nose, destroying his oxygen mask. Blood ran down his face. His hands were bleeding. Fire erupted somewhere in the cockpit. Flames licked around his boots. Johnson felt the aircraft begin to spin, the controls going slack in his hands as hydraulic pressure bled away into the wind. The natural human response to fire in an aircraft at 25,000 feet is immediate. Get out. Johnson braced his boots against the cockpit floor and pulled with all his strength on the canopy release. The canopy did not move. He pulled again, muscles straining. Nothing. The 20mm shell that had exploded behind his seat had warped the canopy frame, jamming it shut. He was trapped inside a burning, spinning fighter, blinded by hydraulic fluid, breathing thin air through a destroyed oxygen mask, watching the Earth spin into view and then vanish as his P-47 tumbled toward the ground like a coin flipped into a fountain. Johnson stopped fighting the canopy and resigned himself to death. This was how it would end, he thought. In flames, in a foreign sky, 23 years old, another name added to the casualty lists his squadron commander would transmit to England that evening. But then something miraculous happened. The fire went out. Whether the flames consumed all available fuel, whether the rushing wind snuffed them, whether some merciful physical law intervened, Johnson never knew. The fire simply died. And in that moment of reprieve, survival instinct overcame resignation. If he could not bail out, perhaps he could fly. Johnson grasped the control stick and fought to level the aircraft. The P-47 responded, sluggishly, unwillingly, but it responded. The spinning stopped. Johnson pulled back gently on the stick, and impossibly, miraculously, the battered Thunderbolt began to climb. His vision was compromised. Hydraulic fluid had swollen, his eyes nearly shut, and engine oil coated the windscreen so thickly he could barely see forward. He stuck his head through the shattered canopy to get his bearings, and the icy wind at altitude tore across his swollen eyes with excruciating intensity. But he could see enough. France was still below him. England was north. He turned toward home. Johnson had no working instruments. No hydraulic pressure meant no flaps, no brakes, possibly no landing gear. His radio might or might not function. He was flying on instinct and memory, nursing a crippled aircraft across hostile territory at low altitude, trying to reach the English Channel before German flak batteries or marauding fighters finished what the initial attack had started. His speed was barely above stalling. The P-47 wanted to fall out of the sky, but Johnson kept it flying through sheer force of will. He was over the coast, perhaps 10 minutes from safety, when he saw the silhouette approaching from his 6 o'clock position, another aircraft. For a brief, desperate moment, Johnson hoped it might be a fellow American. But as the fighter drew close enough for his blurred vision to resolve details, that hope died. It was an WWII, blue and yellow markings, a German Aces aircraft, and it was positioning itself directly behind Johnson's crippled Thunderbolt for what pilots called the coup de grâce, the mercy kill. The pilot flying that Flub 190 may have been Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, though records remain uncertain. What is documented is that Meyer was one of Germany's deadliest aces, credited with over 60 victories by June 1943. He had been developed, along with another German ace named Georg Peter Eder, the head-on attack technique that proved devastating against American bomber formations. Meyer had received the Knight's Cross from Hitler himself just weeks earlier. He was experienced, skilled, and ruthless in combat. The German pilot pulled alongside Johnson's P-47, close enough that Johnson could see him studying the battered American fighter. Bullet holes riddled every surface. The canopy was shattered. Hydraulic fluid streaked backward from the cockpit. Sections of aluminum skin had been peeled away entirely, exposing the aircraft's internal structure. It looked less like a functioning war machine and more like scrap metal held together by momentum and prayer. The German pilot rocked his wings, a salute, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the damage, then dropped back and positioned himself for the kill. Johnson could do nothing but huddle behind the armoured plate behind his seat and wait. He had no ammunition left. He had no ability to manoeuvre. The hydraulic systems that powered his control surfaces were compromised. He could only fly straight and level, a perfect target. The German opened fire. The Fu 190's machine guns and cannon sent streams of projectiles into the P-47. Bullets raked across the wings and fuselage. More holes appeared in the aluminum skin. But the P-47 did not explode. It did not disintegrate. It absorbed the punishment and kept flying. The German pilot broke off, climbed, repositioned, and attacked again. More cannon fire. More impacts. More holes. Still the Thunderbolt flew. A third attack. The German must have been astonished. No German fighter could absorb this level of damage. The WWII and Messerschmitt Bf 109 were brilliant aircraft, engineered for speed and agility, but they were fragile. A well-placed burst could sever a fuel line or rupture a coolant jacket, and the aircraft would be lost. Yet this massive American fighter, already so thoroughly destroyed it, should not be capable of flight, refused to die. Finally, the German pilot's ammunition ran out. He pulled alongside Johnson once more, close enough that both men could see each other through their respective canopies. According to Johnson's account, the German raised his hand, whether in salute, respect, or simple disbelief, rocked his wings, and turned away toward France. Johnson was alone again, but he was still alive, and his P-47 was still flying. Ahead, through breaks in the oil-smeared windscreen, Johnson could see the grey waters of the English Channel. Beyond that, the green fields of Kent. He had made it. An English voice crackled over his radio. Air-Sea Rescue had been listening to his transmissions during the entire ordeal, though Johnson had not realized his microphone had been keyed open throughout the attack. They had heard everything: the impacts, the screaming engine, Johnson's curses as he fought the canopy. Now they guided him toward the nearest forward operating base. Manston Airfield appeared below. Johnson had no flaps to slow his descent, no brakes to stop his landing roll, and he was unsure whether his landing gear would extend. He pulled the emergency gear release, and by some additional miracle, the main wheels dropped and locked. The tires had not been hit. Johnson lined up on the grass runway. Manston had recently been converted from grass to accommodate damaged aircraft, making emergency landings, and brought the P-47 down. Without flaps, his approach speed was dangerously high. Without brakes, he could not slow once he touched down. The Thunderbolt hit the ground hard and refused to stop, rolling at high speed toward a line of parked RAF Spitfires and Typhoons at the runway's far end. In desperation, Johnson stomped on the left rudder pedal. The P-47 ground-looped, sliding backward through the grass, and came to rest perfectly positioned between two British fighters, as though it had been parked there intentionally by a ground crew. Johnson sat in the cockpit for several long moments, gathering his wits. His face was burned, his hands were bleeding, a bullet had nicked his nose, his eyes were swollen nearly shut from the hydraulic fluid. His legs were peppered with shrapnel from the 7.92mm rounds that had penetrated the cockpit. He pried the canopy open. It took assistance from the ground crew and climbed down onto the wing. When his boots touched the grass, his legs nearly gave out. Then he looked at his aircraft, and he stopped counting bullet holes after he reached 200 on just one side of the fuselage. 21 separate 20mm cannon shell impacts were documented. The hydraulic lines were severed. The fuel tanks had been punctured but had self-sealed, preventing fire and catastrophic fuel loss. The engine, that massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 radial, had absorbed direct hits but continued running. Entire sections of the aircraft's skin had been shot away. The tail surfaces were shredded. The landing gear struts had survived intact purely by chance. All hell was scrapped on the spot. Too much damage, nothing salvageable, but it had gotten Johnson home. Less than a week after his P-47 was destroyed at Manston, Robert Johnson returned to combat. His new aircraft bore a name that reflected both superstition and truth: Lucky. The ground crew chief who worked on Johnson's planes, a man named Pappy Gould, understood what the name really meant. It was not that Johnson was lucky. It was that the P-47 Thunderbolt was built differently than any fighter aircraft flying in 1943. To understand why Johnson survived when he should have died, one must understand the machine that saved him. The story begins not on the morning of June 26th over France, but 3 years earlier in a design office at Republic Aviation on Long Island, where a Georgian immigrant engineer named Alexander Kartveli faced an impossible problem. In June of 1940, the United States Army Air Corps had rejected Kartveli's initial fighter design as inadequate. The lightweight fighter he had proposed, powered by an Allison inline engine and armed with 6 machine guns, would be outclassed by German fighters, then dominating European skies. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Fokker-Wulf 4 190 were setting new standards for fighter performance. Any American fighter entering service in the coming years would need to match or exceed German capabilities. Kartvelli's original design could not. Rather than incrementally improve his rejected design, Kartvelli made a radical decision. He started over. He abandoned the pursuit of lightweight agility, the prevailing fighter philosophy since the biplane era, and instead pursued a different goal: overwhelming power combined with survivability. If his fighter could not outturn German aircraft, it would outdive them, outclimb them at altitude, and above all, it would bring its pilots home. At the heart of Kartvelli's redesigned aircraft was the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, two-row radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. This was not the sleek inline engine favoured by European designers. It was a massive, air-cooled radial, a configuration that dated back to the earliest days of aviation. But the R-2800 possessed qualities that inline engines could not match. It was robust, it was reliable, and it could absorb catastrophic damage and continue running. A liquid-cooled inline engine, like those powering German fighters and the celebrated P-51 Mustang, depended on an intact cooling system. A single bullet through a coolant line meant engine failure within minutes. The pilot would be forced to bail out or crash land in enemy territory, but a radial engine had no coolant. Each cylinder was independently cooled by air flowing through cooling fins. A fighter could lose entire cylinders, have them literally shot away, and the remaining cylinders would continue firing. Pilots reported making it home with 3 or 4 cylinders destroyed, the engine running rough but running. Republic Aviation coupled this engine with a turbo supercharger system that allowed the P-47 to maintain power at altitudes where other fighters choked for air. At 30,000 feet, where the air is thin and cold, the Thunderbolt's engine could still produce full power. This gave American pilots a crucial advantage. They could dictate engagement terms. If a fight went poorly, they could climb. German fighters operating at high altitude struggled with reduced power from their superchargers. The P-47 did not. But raw power alone did not explain Johnson's survival. The airframe itself was built for punishment. The P-47's fuselage structure used heavy-gauge aluminum and redundant load paths. If one structural member failed, others could carry the load. The wings were thick, far thicker than those of European fighters, and this thickness provided space for robust wing spars that could absorb battle damage without catastrophic failure. Control cables were duplicated where possible. Hydraulic lines, when severed, had emergency backup systems. The cockpit was protected by armor plate. Behind the pilot's seat was a solid steel plate 1 inch thick, weighing over 60 pounds. This plate could stop any machine gun round and many cannon shells. It had saved Johnson's life when the German pilot positioned behind him opened fire. Additional armor protected the pilot from below and to the sides. The windscreen was laminated armored glass. Every design decision prioritized pilot survival. The fuel system employed self-sealing fuel tanks, rubber-lined tanks that would swell and seal when punctured by bullets. This prevented fuel fires and explosions, the leading cause of fighter losses in combat. Multiple fuel tanks were distributed throughout the aircraft, so damage to one tank did not necessarily mean loss of all fuel. Johnson's aircraft had taken hits to its fuel tanks, but the self-sealing design had prevented the catastrophic fire that would have destroyed a German fighter in the same circumstances. Even the P-47's much criticized weight became an advantage in combat. At over 17,000 pounds fully loaded, the Thunderbolt possessed tremendous inertia. Once accelerated in a dive, it was nearly impossible to stop. German fighters attempting to follow P-47 seconds in high-speed dives found their controls locking up from aerodynamic forces before they could catch the heavier American aircraft. The weight that made the P-47 sluggish in turning fights made it nearly unstoppable in vertical maneuvers. The armament reflected the same philosophy of overwhelming force. 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns were mounted in the wings, 4 per side. Each gun was loaded with 425 rounds, over 3,000 rounds total. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they produced a stream of 100 bullets per second, converging at a point approximately 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. The weight of fire was devastating. German pilots reported that when P-47 seconds opened fire, their targets did not merely fall from the sky, they disintegrated. One pilot was reportedly cut in half before he knew what hit him. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the P-47's design was one that military planners had not initially recognized. It could be produced in enormous quantities. The aircraft's relatively simple construction compared to the precision-engineered German fighters meant that Republic Aviation could manufacture them at scale. Between 1941 and 1945, Republic produced over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts. This was more than any other American fighter. The sheer industrial capacity represented by those numbers would eventually overwhelm German defences. The German pilots who laughed at the P-47's ungainly appearance in early 1943 would not be laughing by year's end. Word of encounters like Johnson's spread through Luftwaffe squadrons. German aces who had previously dismissed the Thunderbolt as easy prey began treating it with respect and caution. They had discovered that shooting down a P-47 required either exceptional marksmanship, targeting the pilot directly, since the aircraft itself could absorb incredible punishment, or overwhelming numbers. Neither advantage could be reliably achieved as the air war intensified. Johnson spent several days recovering from his wounds. The burns on his face, hands and legs were treated. The shrapnel was removed from his body. His Purple Heart was authorized. But the psychological wounds were harder to address. Johnson had experienced what psychologists would later term survival guilt, the question of why he had survived when others had not. 4 other pilots from the 56th Fighter Group were killed in that same engagement on June 26th. A 5th pilot, Samuel Hamilton, had to bail out over the English Channel when his landing gear would not extend. Hamilton was rescued, but his aircraft was lost. Johnson's survival became a story told and retold throughout the 8th Air Force. Pilots heard about the lieutenant who took over 200 hits and made it home. They heard about the German ace who emptied his guns trying to finish off a crippled P-47 and failed. The story became proof of something pilots desperately needed to believe, that their aircraft could save them. That American engineering and industrial might provided a margin of survival their enemies did not possess. The psychological impact on German pilots was equally significant, though harder to document. For experienced Luftwaffe aces accustomed to destroying enemy aircraft with short, precise bursts of cannon fire, the P-47 represented a disturbing anomaly. It violated their understanding of aerial combat. An aircraft so thoroughly damaged should not remain airborne, yet it did. And this meant that even when German pilots achieved what should have been killing shots, their targets might escape. The certainty required for aggressive combat flying began to erode. Egon Meyer, the German ace who may have been Johnson's tormentor that day, would himself fall victim to P-47 seconds less than a year later. On March 2, 1944, Meyer led an attack against an American bomber formation. P-47 escort fighters from the 355th Fighter Group intercepted his formation. In the ensuing battle, Meyer's WWII-190 was hit by 50 caliber fire from a Thunderbolt flown by Lieutenant Walter Gresham. Meyer crashed near Montmédy, France, and was killed. He had achieved 102 aerial victories, the first German pilot to reach 100 victories entirely on the Western Front. His death at the hands of the aircraft type he had once failed to destroy carried a bitter irony. Johnson, meanwhile, continued flying combat missions. By October of 1943, he had become an ace, credited with 5 confirmed kills. His tactical approach evolved. He abandoned the rigid formation flying doctrine that dominated early American fighter tactics and instead developed a more flexible system. The first pilot in his flight to spot enemy aircraft would lead the attack, regardless of rank or position. This violated established procedure but proved devastatingly effective. Johnson and his three wingmen became the highest-scoring four-plane element in the entire United States Army Air Forces. The missions accumulated. January of 1944 brought 4 more victories. February added 2. March was particularly successful, 6 enemy aircraft destroyed. By April, Johnson had been promoted to captain. On May 8, 1944, Johnson flew his final combat mission, an escort mission deep into Germany. He downed a Messerschmitt Bf 109 and a Focke-Wulf 4, 190, bringing his total to 27 confirmed victories. This made him the first American pilot in the European theatre to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Johnson completed his combat tour having flown 91 missions. He had encountered German fighters 43 times. In 36 of those encounters, he fired his guns. He was credited with 27 destroyed, 6 probable, and 4 damaged, though Luftwaffe records examined after the war suggested his actual total might have been as high as 32. His closest rival was Francis Gaby Gabreski, another P-47 pilot from the 56th Fighter Group. Gabreski would eventually claim 28 victories, but he required 153 missions to achieve that score. Johnson's efficiency, 27 victories, in 91 missions, spoke to both his skill and his willingness to engage aggressively. After his combat tour ended, Johnson returned to the United States in June of 1944, just as the Allied invasion of Europe was beginning. He was assigned to a war bond publicity tour, traveling across America to rally civilian support for the war effort. In one memorable appearance at the Republic Aviation Factory on Long Island, thousands of workers who had built the P-47 seconds gathered to hear Johnson speak. He told them about June 26, 1943. He described the bullet holes, the fire, the jammed canopy. He explained how their work, the steel armor plate, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the robust airframe had saved his life. The workers wept and applauded. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that the aircraft they built were not merely weapons, they were life-preservation machines. During this tour, Johnson met Richard "Dick" Bong, who was then the top-scoring American ace in the Pacific Theatre, with 27 victories, the same number as Johnson. Bong would return to combat and eventually achieve 40 victories before his death in a P-80 jet crash in 1945. Johnson remained in the United States. His combat flying concluded. The P-47 Thunderbolt continued fighting in Europe and the Pacific until the war's end. It flew more than 500,000 combat missions and dropped 132,000 tons of bombs. Its loss rate was extraordinarily low, 0.07% per mission. This meant that for every 1,000 P-47 sorties, only 7 aircraft were lost, an astonishing survival rate for combat operations. Of the 15,683 P-47 seconds produced, only 3,499 were lost in combat. The remaining aircraft brought their pilots home. The Thunderbolt's reputation for survivability became legendary not only in American squadrons but in other theaters as well. Soviet pilots who flew P-47 seconds under the Lend-Lease program praised its ruggedness. British pilots acknowledged that while they preferred the agility of their Spitfires, they respected the P-47's ability to absorb punishment. Even captured German pilots, when interrogated about Allied aircraft, admitted that the Thunderbolt was their least favorite opponent, not because it was the most dangerous in a turning fight, but because it was nearly impossible to kill with certainty. After the war, Johnson remained in the Air Force Reserve, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He joined Republic Aviation as an engineering executive, where his first major project was redesigning the P-47's cockpit layout to make instruments more accessible at a glance changes, informed by his combat experience. He spent 18 years with Republic before transitioning to the insurance industry. Throughout his post-war life, Johnson remained connected to the aviation community, speaking at air shows and reunions, always emphasizing the debt he owed to the engineers and factory workers who had built the aircraft that saved him. Johnson's memoir, Thunderbolt, co-written with Martin Kaidin, was published in 1958 and became essential reading for aviation enthusiasts and military historians. The book's detailed accounts of combat flying provided insights into the daily reality of fighter operations over Europe, the cold at altitude, the fear before missions, the intensity of combat, the exhaustion afterward. But the book's central message was gratitude. Gratitude for the machine that had refused to die, gratitude for the industrial system that had produced it, gratitude for the engineers who had prioritized pilot survival over aesthetic elegance. In the decades following the war, the story of Johnson's survival on June 26, 1943, became a case study in aircraft design philosophy. Engineering schools analyzed what made the P-47 so resilient. The lessons learned influenced subsequent aircraft development. The emphasis on redundant systems, armored protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust construction became standard practice in military aviation. Modern fighter aircraft, from the F-15 Eagle to the A-10 Thunderbolt II, which was deliberately named in honor of its predecessor, incorporated design principles pioneered by Alexander Kartveli and the Republic Aviation Team. The A-10, in particular, embodied the P-47's philosophy taken to its logical extreme, an aircraft built entirely around pilot survival and mission completion, aesthetic beauty be damned. Like its spiritual ancestor, the A-10 featured redundant control systems, armored protection, widely spaced engines that could operate independently, and the ability to fly home with substantial portions of the aircraft destroyed. The A-10's official nickname is Thunderbolt II, but pilots call it the Warthog, an acknowledgement, like Jug before it, that function matters more than form. Johnson's survival also highlighted a crucial difference between American and German aviation doctrine during World War II. German aircraft were engineering marvels, sleek, fast, maneuverable, and precise, but they were optimized for performance rather than survivability. This reflected a broader German military culture that emphasized individual skill and aggressive tactics. Losses were expected. Replacement aircraft could be built. The system could not, however, replace experienced pilots at the rate they were being killed. As the war progressed, the Luftwaffe's pilot training program deteriorated. Inexperienced pilots were sent into combat with minimal training, and they died in disproportionate numbers. American doctrine, by contrast, emphasized bringing pilots home. An experienced pilot was more valuable than any aircraft. If a plane could be designed to save a pilot's life, even at the cost of some performance that was a made worthwhile trade. The P-47 represented this philosophy perfectly. It was not the most elegant fighter, it was not the fastest or most maneuverable, but it excelled at its primary mission, keeping American pilots alive long enough to complete their tours and return home. This difference in approach had strategic implications. As the air war intensified through 1943 and 1944, the Luftwaffe hemorrhaged experienced pilots while the United States Army Air Forces accumulated combat veterans. German aces with hundreds of victories were increasingly rare. American squadrons, meanwhile, were filled with pilots like Johnson who had survived long enough to develop tactical expertise. The experience gap widened with each passing month. By mid-1944, even average American pilots had advantages in training, experience and confidence that German pilots could not match. The industrial dimension was equally important. Germany produced approximately 20,000 F-2W-190 during the war, a respectable number. But the United States produced over 15,000 P-47 seconds, 12,000 P-51 Mustangs, and thousands of other fighter aircraft. The sheer weight of production meant that even heavy losses could be quickly replaced. For Germany, each aircraft lost represented a significant portion of dwindling manufacturing capacity. For the United States, aircraft losses were painful but manageable. American factories could produce fighters faster than combat operations could destroy them. This industrial superiority was not lost on German prisoners of war. Many captured Luftwaffe pilots, when taken to Allied airfields or transported through areas with visible American equipment, experienced a profound psychological shock. The abundance of aircraft, vehicles, supplies, and fuel revealed an industrial capacity so vast it seemed almost incomprehensible. German propaganda had consistently emphasized shortages and sacrifice, framing the war as a struggle for survival against numerically superior enemies. But the material reality visible at any American airbase demonstrated that the Allies possessed not merely numerical superiority, but overwhelming industrial dominance. Some German pilots later recounted that seeing American airfields rows of pristine P-47 seconds, fuel trucks lined up with gasoline to spare, maintenance crews with every tool they needed was the moment they understood Germany could not win the war. No amount of individual skill or tactical brilliance could overcome such disparity in resources. It was a revelation that destroyed morale more effectively than any propaganda. Johnson himself rarely discussed the broader strategic implications of his survival. He remained focused on the personal and immediate, the friends who did not return, the missions that went wrong, the constant awareness that each flight might be his last. But he understood, perhaps better than most, that his survival had depended on a system, a network of engineers, factory workers, logistics personnel, and tactical innovators that functioned at a level German could not match. Robert Johnson died on December 27, 1998, at the age of 78. His obituaries noted his 27 aerial victories and his status as one of America's top aces. But those who had known him emphasized different aspects of his character: his humility, his respect for the ground crews who maintained his aircraft, his insistence on crediting the P-47 rather than his own skill for his survival. In an era that celebrated individual heroism, Johnson consistently deflected attention toward the collective effort that had made victory possible. The P-47 Thunderbolt he flew on June 26, 1943, the aircraft designated P-47C-2RE, serial number 41-6235, nicknamed All Hell, was scrapped at Manston shortly after his landing. No museum would preserve it. No restoration effort would resurrect it. The aircraft was too damaged, its value reduced to salvageable parts that might keep other Thunderbolts flying. In a sense, this was fitting. The P-47 was never about individual glory or preservation for posterity. It was about function, getting the pilot home, completing the mission, winning the war. But the story of what that aircraft accomplished in its final flight lived on. It became proof that engineering decisions made in peacetime design offices could mean the difference between life and death in combat. It demonstrated that American industrial capacity could produce weapons that prioritized not just offensive capability, but defensive resilience. It showed that survival in aerial combat depended not merely on pilot skill or tactical doctrine, but on the physical properties of metal, rubber, and armor plate. The lesson extends beyond aviation history. Johnson's survival illustrates a fundamental principle about technological competition. The winner is not always the system that performs best under ideal conditions, but the system that continues functioning when everything goes wrong. German fighters were faster and more maneuverable than the P-47 inches certain flight regimes. But when battle damage accumulated, when systems failed, when survival depended on robustness rather than elegance, the Thunderbolt's design philosophy proved superior. This principle applies to many domains beyond combat aircraft. In engineering, in organizational design, in strategic planning, The ability to absorb damage and continue functioning, what modern engineers call graceful degradation, often determines long-term success more than peak performance. The P-47 was not built to be the best fighter under perfect conditions. It was built to be good enough under the worst conditions. That philosophy saved Robert Johnson's life and thousands of others. In the end, Johnson's story is not primarily about individual heroism, though courage was certainly required to keep flying after June 26th. It is not primarily about aerial combat tactics, though Johnson developed innovative approaches that increased his squadron's effectiveness. It is fundamentally a story about design philosophy, industrial capacity, and the recognition that in warfare, as in much of life, resilience matters more than perfection. The massive, ungainly P-47 Thunderbolt that German pilots mocked in early 1943 became the aircraft they most feared by war's end. It absorbed punishment that should have been fatal and kept flying. It brought its pilots home when sleeker, more elegant aircraft would have failed, and in doing so, it demonstrated a truth that Alexander Kartveli and Republic Aviation had understood from the beginning. The best weapon is not always the most impressive. Sometimes, the best weapon is simply the one that refuses to quit. Robert Johnson lived 55 years after that June morning over France. He raised a family, built a career, became part of a generation that shaped post-war America. But he never forgot the moment when his P-47 should have fallen from the sky and did not. He never forgot the German pilot who emptied his guns trying to finish him off and failed. And he never forgot that his survival depended on thousands of people he would never meet. The engineers who calculated stress loads, the factory workers who riveted armor plate, the metallurgists who developed self-sealing fuel tanks. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.